and I do hope that you can hear me quite well. Um, you may have heard just very quickly some sound in the background in Father Roman's presentation. We just had a siren informing that the attacks are paused for a while. And currently I'm at home, but my electricity is off. But in Ukraine, we are trying to overcome our obstacles. We have our batteries. We have other equipment to help us connect to the internet. So I hope that our communication will be uninterrupted. We live in such a context that is really difficult to imagine when you live in the country where there is no war. And I myself would never imagine living in these circumstances. But what I'm trying to say is that despite anything, you're trying to work here, do research, think, unite, and this school is a wonderful sign that despite anything, we want to work and we want to build bridges and bring fruits. So this is just my brief introduction. What I would like to do today with you in my lecture is to look at the historical background, at least a little with some important historical events from the last 30 years of Ukraine's independence so that you understand the context of the war that is taking place. I would like to also take a look from ecological perspective, because ecological question, as you will discover, was always present even 40, 30 years ago. It was an important factor for a transformation of a society in Europe, in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe. So that is part of my presentation. And also, I would like to share with you some theological reflections on this on what's going on around us. So let me start with the main principle of the so-called eco-hermeneutics. It's an ecological reading of biblical text. It's a principle that was mentioned already by some of the speakers. It's a principle of interconnectedness, according to which the earth is a collective of interconnected living beings that depend on each other for life and survival. It was defined by the so-called Earth Bible Project. It's an international project that was launched some 30 years ago, in fact, in Boston area, that is rereading the scripture from the perspective of the giving the voice to the earth, how animals, stones, rivers exist in Bible and how they are presented and how they also find the way to express their own identity. Because as we all know, God created humans according to God's image and likeness. But we also know that a very beautiful Syriac theologian from the 4th century, he has this image that when God was creating the world, he was looking at the mirror. So the whole world is actually reflecting God's wisdom, God's knowledge, God's beauty, God's intellect. And so our full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation into Ukraine became a painful confirmation of what eco-theologians have been saying and writing for decades. We live in a world where people, animals, birds, trees, rivers, and earth, the grounds, are united in struggle and survival. If earlier the majority of Ukrainians thought about the war in the categories of society, politics, global economy, and conflicting ideologies, not just Ukrainians, but mainly when the wars occurred, that's what we think about, the politics, the economies. But in nowadays, this direct experience of war opens a new perspective, namely an ecological one. It turned out that not only the military and civilian population, but also God's creation is affected by rocket attacks, explosions, and street fighters. Almost immediately after the start of the hostilities and evacuation of people from dangerous places, volunteers began to help abandoned animals. Ukrainian and international mass media publicized the story of Ukrainians saving animals at the risk of their own lives, and the international community discussed the devastating consequences of the Russian-Ukrainian war for the European and for the world environment. Therefore, this interconnectedness as a hermeneutic principle is suitable not only for the interpretation of biblical texts, but also for the explanation of modern events in the world. Theology after Bucha. This is something that we are now thinking. I don't know if you know what is Bucha. Bucha is a city or a village near Kiev where it was under occupation after it was liberated. In the aftermath. In a couple of months, we discovered that in Bucha, Russians were taking people as in prisons and tortured them, just like very similar to what happened, what did the Germans in Auschwitz. So there was, and now, I don't know if you heard the latest news, the genocide of Russians against Ukrainians is recognized now by the international law. So theology after Bucha, just like theology after Auschwitz, must be public. That is, it has to respond to the current pressing problems of society. And since the environmental problems only worsened during the war, theological thought must also be ecological. Today's talk is an attempt to understand the Russian-Ukrainian war from the perspective of eco-theology. We construct an environmental war narrative consisting of three parts or dimensions: historical, environmental, and theological. And thereby, I would like to demonstrate how Russia's war against Ukraine is directly related to environmental issues, and how ecology, justice, and peace are tightly interdependent. So, historical perspective. The long and traumatic experience of Ukraine's enslavement under Russian or Soviet rule demonstrated that Ukrainian land has no other value for the empire, for the Russian Empire, no other value than the economic. The extensive nature of the Soviet economy, excessive concentration of production capacity on the territory of Ukraine, neglect for environmental issues, and the impact of industrial activity on the environment, all this led to serious environmental problems, since the empire does not care about the colonies. It exploits and exhausts them. Understanding this became a powerful catalyst for the Ukrainian national movement in the late 1980s and early 1990s. A prospect of Ukrainians' loss of independence in this war, in this current war, would also lead to the situation in which the Ukrainian land would again turn into a raw material appendage of Russia, and no one would worry about the environment. So this is something that we understand, that we are fighting for certain values. We are fighting for a certain worldview in which we live. And if we lose this war, this neglect for human life, for justice, for international law, and also for environment will take place. During the last 4 decades, for the last 40 years, after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, the struggle for independence and the development of environmental consciousness have been closely linked in Ukraine. Since Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, a modification of the Russian Empire, there could be no question of political independence and self-government, which was expressed in the management of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Decisions regarding the operation of the power plant and the composition of scientific and technical personnel were all made in Moscow. The vast majority of the station's employees were Russians, and this actually limited the political, economic, and scientific independence of Ukrainians. Instead, political ambitions multiplied by the irresponsibility and incompetence of the Soviet leaders led to the nuclear accident on April 26, 1986. The explosion was equivalent to the explosion of 500 nuclear bombs, little boy, which were dropped in Hiroshima. Let me just repeat that one more time. That explosion that took place in Chernobyl was close to 500 nuclear bombs, such as little boy. About 3 million people then were directly affected by radiation in Ukraine alone. More than 50,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian land was contaminated with radiation. This catastrophic environmental consequences of the accident became a catalyst for political activism among Ukrainians. As noted by historian Serhiy Plokhy, the Chernobyl disaster woke up Ukraine, raising fundamental questions about the relationship between the center and the republics, the Communist Party, and the people, and helping to start the first public discussion in a society that was struggling to regain its voice after decades of Brezhnev stagnation. The following year, after the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the first Ukrainian environmental non-governmental organization, Green World, was created. The organization included Ukrainian writers, scientists, professors, journalists, and students. They were worried about the plans of the Soviet government to build several more nuclear power plants on the territory of Ukraine. This organization, the Green World, created a program, and it proclaimed the sovereignty of Ukraine over its natural resources and the openness of environmental information to all citizens, which will later be reflected in the text of the Constitution of Ukraine in the Article 13, Article 50, respectively. On November 13th, 1988, a mass meeting devoted to environmental problems was held in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine. The key organizers of this rally were organizations called Green World, Heritage, Noosphere, and Community. The motifs and demands of the demonstrators were both environmental and political. For example, Alexander Shevchenko, speaking from the Ukrainian Helsinki Union, read an appeal that contained demands for a national referendum during which the Ukrainian people must declare their will to live, and called on all those present to sign the appeal to the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR with the demand to stop the discussion of the draft law that planned to restrict the rights of all Union republics and nations. There were other factors that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course. A senseless and disastrous war in Afghanistan, a failing economic system, international pressure, rising appeal to religious freedom and consciousness in different parts of the Soviet Union that led to legalization of the various religious communities, among them the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. But the concern for the ecology was stirred by the apocalyptic scenery of the global collapse, played one of the key roles. Chernobyl, let me note, is a Ukrainian name for the wormwood. And let me quickly read from the book of Apocalypse. This is chapter 8, verse 10, 11. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and the great star, blazing like torch, fell from the sky on the third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star was Wormwood. A third of waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. So even for the skeptical atheists, a lot of people in Ukraine and around the Soviet Union, they realized that this explosion at the Chernobyl location was perhaps one of the fourth seal that was opened and reflecting the prophecies that we have in the book of Apocalypse. This was threatening, and this was, as you know, from the theological point of view, The book of Apocalypse can be read as a story about the end of the world, but it can also be read as a call for conversion, a call for awakening, a call for action. And that's what happened really in these years. On August 24th, 1991, Ukraine proclaimed its independence. The Act of Independence reestablished Ukraine's state from the Soviet Union. The declaration was affirmed by the majority of Ukrainians in all regions of Ukraine by an independence referendum on December 1st, followed by the international recognition starting on the following day. In the independence referendum on December 1st, 1991, the people of Ukraine expressed deep and widespread support for the act of declaration of independence, with more than 90% voting in favor and 84% of the electorate participating. The referendum took place on the same day as Ukraine's first direct presidential election. All 6 presidential candidates supported independence and campaigned for a yes vote. The referendum's passage ended any realistic chance for the Soviet Union remaining together, even on a limited scale. A week after the election, namely the elected president Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine joined his Russian and Belarusian counterparts, Boris Yeltsin and Stanislav Shushkevich, respectively, in signing the Belovesh Accords, which declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. The Soviet Union officially dissolved on December 26th. However, for about 10 years, a promised quick economic transformation of Ukraine did not take place. After the crash of the communist elite, a new elite came into power, which we call oligarchate. Hence, a new awakening of the political active part of Ukrainian society to overcome corruption and oppose Russian political influence was manifested in the Orange Revolution of 2004-2005, which incidentally or not incidentally took place after the visit of the Holy Father John Paul II in June 25th, 27th. We just celebrated an anniversary of the visit of the Pope to Ukraine a couple of days ago. The Orange Revolution brought a lot of positive change in the Ukrainian society, such as a positive economic growth and steady integration with the European Union, at least in some institutions. Respectively, 10 years later, the Revolution of Dignity in 2013, 2014 took place. Although the environmental theme was not the central to the participants of the protests, the revolution still had a very strong environmental dimension. First, the association agreement between Ukraine and European Union, the signing of which was disrupted by Yanukovych, at that time the president of Ukraine, thereby provoking the Euromaidan in November 2013, included the entire section on the environment. Secondly, a sociological study of the values of Euromaidan participants revealed the value of caring for the nature and the whole environment. Thirdly, the constitutionally enshrined course on European integration, one of the achievements of the Revolution of Dignity, became a driving force for a number of reforms in the field of environmental protection. For example, the adoption of the law on monitoring, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gases, and others. However, the Revolution of Dignity did not lead to significant changes in the environmental sphere, not least because of the annexation of Crimea, the occupation of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and the beginning of military aggression by the Russian Federation, which made the environmental issues less of a priority. Or in the words of Yuval Noah Harari, if a nation also faces external invasion, who will have time to worry about polluted rivers? At the same time, Russian military aggression over the past 10 years has helped Ukrainians to better understand their fundamental and unifying values. As noted by Ukrainian sociologist Mikhailo Vinnytsky, The only thing that doesn't cause questions and disputes within Ukrainian society is the map of Ukraine. He writes, the territory on the map was considered sacred. It was the place of birth and life. It was life-giving. The slogan, the land of the good, seems to have united all Ukrainians. And although its meaning seemed banal for foreigners, it was the concept that personified Ukraine for its citizens and united them for its protection. This creates an environmental dimension for interpreting the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine that began on November 24th, 2022. Even now, when the negotiations take place, and sometimes Russians are expressing this idea that they will stop the war if Ukrainians will just allow the Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk regions be part of Russia, and then they will stop. But we understand from the history that this will not be a solution, because Russians always take the opportunity of these so-called negotiations. There were Minsk agreements and so on and so forth, only to regroup and to invade forward. For us, for Ukrainians, our land is a sacred land. It's part of our identity, and this is not up for a negotiation. Now, let me say a few words about ecological dimension of war. This was already mentioned by Professor Sharonhovsky and Father Yuri Shturko. I will simply give more examples. At present, the Russian-Ukrainian war is limited geographically. Combat operations are conducted mainly on the territory of Ukraine. However, it must be remembered that any military conflict is not local in nature when it comes to the environment. Ecosystems cannot be divided by conventional boundaries simply by drawing them on the map. If the natural balance is destroyed in one geolocation, it will definitely be felt by another. Therefore, the war in Ukraine affects not only the Ukrainian environment, but also European, if not only beyond ecosystems. I could spend time on presenting you facts with air pollution, loss of biodiversity. You just quickly stop at the Kakhovka Dam. You remember that in early hours of June the 6th, 2023, about a year ago, the Kakhovka Dam was breached, causing extensive flooding over the lower Dnieper River, also called the Dnipro, in Kherson Oblast. The dam was under the control of the Russian military at that time, which had seized it in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many experts have concluded that Russian forces likely blew up a segment of the dam to hinder the planned Ukrainian counteroffensive. Russian authorities have denied these accusations. Former Minister of Ecology, Ostap Semerak, said that this was the biggest environmental catastrophe in Ukraine since 1986 Chernobyl disaster. The Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group issued a report that detailed the environmental devastation. More than 50,000 hectares, which is 120,000 acres of Ukrainian forests, have been flooded, and at least half of them, those trees, died, of course. This is more than the area of forest in Iceland. The Kakhovka reservoir was covered with 95,000 tons of dead fish. I can go on and on presenting how much damage this caused to that region. We constantly hear about the threats to nuclear and radiation safety. We've been witnessing the damage of natural reserves and protected ecosystems, chemical soil pollution, as you know, modern machinery, modern explosives, modern bombs, are all extremely devastating for the soil, for the grounds, and which goes into the rivers, it goes into the air, it goes everywhere. Over 500,000 military personnel, over a million, half of a million personnel on both sides, 500,000 of Ukrainians and 500,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded during this war so far, and more than 30,000 civilians have been killed or injured. We also have devastating numbers of several thousand children that are also victims of this war, and we know about thousands of children that were kidnapped by the Russians and taken to Russia. Indirect health effects of the war have likely accounted for even greater amount of civilian morbidity and mortality. The war has displaced more than 11 million people. Russia's military forces have caused extensive damage to civilian infrastructure. The war has devastated Ukraine's economy and reduced food and energy security in many countries. The war caused more than 56 billion US dollars in damage to the environment, and these are only first estimates, and the numbers will probably go much higher as the years go on. There has been widespread chemical contamination of air, water, and soil, and 30% of Ukraine has been contaminated with landmines and unexploded ordnance. Landscape destruction, shelling, wildfires, deforestation, the pollution have adversely affected more than 30% of Ukraine's protected areas. Russia's seizure of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and destruction of the Novokhovka Dam have posed risks for long-term environmental catastrophe. Most of these environmental impacts threaten human health. In addition to enormous human costs, Russia's war in Ukraine has had devastating impacts on the natural environment and not only, as I said, within Ukraine, but also beyond. International law mandates that methods of warfare must be implemented with due regard to the protection and preservation of the natural environment. A just and lasting peace necessitates, among other requirements, rebuilding and restoration of Ukraine's natural environment and rebuild the ecosystems. The environmental consequences of all wars need to be investigated and more effectively measured. A term of ecocide exists in the Ukrainian law. It doesn't exist so far in international law, but in negotiations and cases are also brought to the European Court of Justice and International Court of Justice. And we do hope that in due time, these crimes will also be brought and persecuted when this is all over. Now, just briefly, my theological dimension or theological reflections. And I would like to focus on the term that, from a theological point of view, is extremely important. It may have a certain negative connotation in secular milieux, but it still has to be brought up. And what I mean is a term, a concept that we call an ecological sin. Considering the destructive effects of war on the environment, one must consider war, among other things, also part of the environmental institutional sin, we call. Different approaches to the interpretation of this kind of sin in light of environmental problems are possible. Ecological sin is usually approached through the moral law, condemning any act that harms God's creation. This approach is found in the works of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant authors. John Paul II had his idea on social sin, and he formulated it in such a way. Let me quote. It is, John Paul II says, it is a violation of the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill, because by destroying the environment, we also kill human souls, human bodies. The seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal, because in it we destroy the environment, which is not ours, but our common property. And also the third commandment of love, because the social dimension of this sin directly affects our neighbors as well. The sin of bishops regarding the Panamanian region defines ecological sin as an act of or omission against God, neighbor, community, and environment. It is cited by Pope Francis in his famous Laudato Si that was just referred previously. And also the bishops of various African conferences of Catholic bishops also reinforced this idea. It is a sin against future generations. It is committed in actions and habits that lead to pollution and destruction of the harmony of the environment. These are offenses against the principle of interconnectedness. They destroy the network of community, of creation, and violate the virtue of justice. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, the current patriarch, made a valuable contribution to the development and spread of the concept of ecological sin. In his article for the Time magazine in 2015, he wrote about the need to expand our narrow and individualistic concept of sin. This expansion of the concept of sin towards more ecological and a collective one can be traced in the writings and speeches of the patriarch during the last 30 years. In 1997 speech, Patriarch Bartholomew said, people who are destroying the biodiversity of God's creation, people who violate the integrity of earth by causing changes in its climate, depriving the earth of its natural forests, and destroying its swamps, people who pollute the waters of the earth, its lands, air, plant, and animal life, they sin. To commit a crime against nature is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God. Watching the Russian invaders commit environmental sins, Christians should strongly condemn them and bring hope to the recovery to the affected Ukrainians. The reign of Christ involves the healing of the earth, and we see this in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 1. But the entrance into the kingdom of God is possible only through faith, repentance, and conversion, which must also be an ecological conversion, about which Pope Francis has explicitly spoken about in his Laudato Si. Pope Francis notes that ecological conversion should be not only individual, but also social. Therefore, in the face of ecological crisis in Ukraine, Christians should be the salt of the earth, expose the sins of society, call the people to ecological conversion, show a worthy example of caring for creation, point to Christ as the source of the evangelical hope for the restoration of the earth. In response to the numerous ecological sins of the Russian invaders, Christians should affirm that where sin abandoned, grace appeared immeasurably. That is, as sin reigned through death, so grace reigns through righteousness for eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord, as Paul says in his letter to Romans. Let me come to my conclusions. Today, indifference to the suffering of other creatures, responsibility for one's own or abandoned pets, love for the native land are the driving forces of eco leadership in Ukraine. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba, aptly wrote about this. War is the suffering of not only people, but also animals. And humanity means taking care of both the former and the latter. This is why many Ukrainians rescue and feed abandoned animals during the war. But it is important that these motifs are preserved and strengthened even after the end of the war, because even more environmental problems will open before us. Ukrainians are dealing with evil and injustice during this war, and only correct response to them is to restore justice and show kindness to all victims of violence, including animals and the entire environment. To paraphrase the saying of the theologian James Nash, a Protestant theologian, those who seek peace must also naturally be passionate eco-activists. Let me stop here. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm open to your questions. And I do express this biblical vision that the whole world that was created in 6 days, metaphorically speaking, is, as we said many times, is interconnected. And when you hurt one part of it, the whole body of creation hurts, is damaged. If we want to heal, we need to heal and convert on the level of our minds, on the level of our hearts, but also in our bodies and our relationships to the world that is around us, to the animals, to the trees, to the water, to the air that we breathe, because humans are as microcosm, as was said by many of the church fathers. Humans are a microcosm living in the macrocosm, in the big world. Again, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to any remarks, questions, conversation, dialogue. Thank you.
It will only make it worth.
Well, thank you so much for this question. You're right. I teach a course on eco-theology to students at UKU, but I also teach similar courses in Sweden at the Newman Institute. And what I find is confirms what you're saying, that there is a certain pessimism, especially among young people, because when they discover the impact of the ecology, this global warming and all this becomes so overwhelming that people either start to ignore it, or they think that it's so big that they cannot do anything about it, so they feel depressed. That there's this kind of interesting study in Western Europe, also in the United States, that this whole conversation about ecological problems is giving people a lot of emotional distress. But at the same time, what I find again among the young people, also older students and people working in different spheres, that when we look at the big picture, of course, it's very overwhelming. But when we understand that if we do little steps, and if we engage personally with various solutions, if you go online, there are hundreds of websites, different organizations that are, just educating you about what you can do in your home, in your neighborhood, in your community to improve ecological thing. And once you start that, and I've seen this with my own eyes as part of my the Center of Eco-Theology and Sustainable Development, together with the students that I teach and other organizations here in Lviv, but also in Ukraine and beyond. Once we start doing something, installing some separation of waste, recycling, once we change our lifestyle, then this pessimism dissipates, and you start understanding that you come to this realization that actually a lot can be done. And here, on the one hand, faith is very important, because Christian faith is actually giving us optimism, giving us hope that despite anything, God is in control of history. That's a very profound theological Christian idea. But at the same time, science, hardcore science, also is giving us hope that we have technologies to switch from the reusable sources of energy into alternative sources of energy. It's a very slow process, but it exists. Very good example is the city of Vatican. It's a small country, the smallest in the world, but they've changed the roof of the Magna Aula, and they're able to provide all their electrical means only from the electrical batteries. It's not, a solution to everything, but it's the step in the right direction. I've seen in the villages here in Ukraine, up in the mountains, and also sometimes in the countryside, that people are changing the roofs with the solar panels, and they're becoming energy independent without coal um, uh, and others non uh, uh, the sources of energy, the traditional sources of energy. It's just one example. We have to have change in the way we dress, in the way we eat, consumption, the whole question of the culture of consumption that is crazy in the Western world. We throw out a lot of food. There's this study in the British Institute of Technology that says that up to 50% of food that produces planet Earth is thrown into the garbage. In the less developed countries, the food is just left in the fields because it's not harvested properly. But in the Western or developed countries, a lot of food is wasted in the supermarkets, because when people come, they're looking for a perfect apple or for perfect tomato. And when there is a little scratch, then a German or an American doesn't want to buy it, even though the product is good. It just takes 5 seconds to cut off perhaps a slight scratch on that product. In any case, it requires a lot of change. Those changes are already existing. It's not something that we have to invent from the scratch. The last 20, 30 years, a lot of wonderful minds from all areas of life, economists, entrepreneurs, sometimes even political voices. We know about European Green Deal. We have in the United States a whole Green Deal, the whole package of redesigning the economy. At least in the Western world, it's much slower in China or in India, but it also is slowly coming there as well. So this pessimism is a real one, but it's not it's but it's not the something that cannot be overcome. We need faith, and we need reason, faith and reason to combine together, and there is a chance that we may revision this world in which we live as a better place for our next generation. Pope Francis has this wonderful saying that we are obliged before our children to give to our children the planet that we inherited. We cannot give to them something that is worse than we received so far. I think more and more people are awakening to this realization, and it's possible. It's not something from beyond. It is feasible, but it takes time. It takes education, conversion, and courage to take action.